House Bill 1063 is an act approved by the General Assembly relating to public accommodations, employment, and housing. Prohibited discrimination on the basis of religion includes outward religious expression. The governor's recommendation is amendment nature substitute. It's available online and is now before the body.
Mr. Speaker.
The delegate from Fairfax, Delegate Simon.
Point of order.
The delegate will state it.
Mr. Speaker, members of the House, House Bill 1063 was a relatively narrow bill that protected outward forms of religious expression and included that in the definition of religious discrimination. It was a bill that had broad support from a wide coalition of groups, human rights groups and others. The governor's amendments, the governor's substitute actually turns that on its head and makes this a bill that has failed in this House several times and makes it a bill that protects people who want to engage in religious discrimination on the basis of their own religious beliefs. And that is not only contrary to the intent, so I think would arguably be non-germane because it's the inverse of the original intent, it also is greatly beyond the scope of the bill that was introduced. I was watching the tapes from 2019. I saw your predecessor, Speaker Cox, rule bills like this non-germane because of the scope and because of the intent. I would ask that you find that this bill, that the governor's amendments to this bill are non-germane.
The House will be at ease. The House will come to order. We are presently on House Bill 1063 and the governor's recommendations. The gentleman from Arlington raised a germaneness question. I find that the language in the governor's amendment is well within the title of the bill and is clarifying in nature, and I so rule.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The delegate from Fairfax, Delegate Shin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to please speak to the governor's recommendation.
The delegate has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As originally passed by this body unanimously on February 15th, House Bill 1063 would have updated the definition of religion to include any outward expression of religious faith, including adherence to religious dressing and grooming practices and the carrying or display of religious items or symbols. HB 1063 aimed to ensure that a person seeking to buy a house, rent an apartment, or find employment, that those Virginians couldn't be discriminated against just because of their articles of faith, such as a headscarf, their grooming practices, or a yarmulke on their head. Sorry, hold on one second. I'm so sorry. My concern, Mr. Speaker, is that despite the overwhelming support for this legislation during session, and it was overwhelming because it also passed the Senate 40-0, the governor has still decided to attempt to change this bill. I'd like to note that HB 1063 passed out of committee 22-0. And I bring that up because we worked really hard to bring together a diversity of stakeholders to support this bill, but not once during that process did I hear from the governor's office or his staff telling me they had concerns with the bill in its original form. I know that both the governor and I are new to Richmond. We're both newbies, so to speak. And in spite of my status as a novice, I know that the way to work a bill is to work in good faith with a patron. But what the governor has sent down is a bad faith amendment and not something I would consider friendly. The governor's recommendation would expand the definition of religion and attempt to actually redefine religion in our code and have it read that religion includes all aspects of religious observance, practice, or belief. HB 1063, as introduced, it had a very specific and narrow scope. It was intended to address articles of faith and outward expressions of religion. In hijacking this bill, the governor has drastically broadened the scope of religion as it is currently defined in our code. My intention was to protect women in the workplace who wear headscarves in observance of their faith, to protect religious minorities and their grooming practices, to ensure people could wear outward expressions of their religion without fear of discrimination. The governor's official recommendation on this bill simply states, the amendment in the nature of a substitute be accepted, without any further explanation whatsoever to clarify his intent or objectives. In practice, the governor's broad and far-reaching language could have chilling implications and permit exactly the opposite of what this legislative body voted for with the underlying bill. As such, I would ask the body to instead please reaffirm our unanimous approval of HB 1063 as originally introduced. There's no reason for us to change course here at this juncture and undermine the will of the legislature, especially in absence of a thorough explanation from the governor's office. Mr. Speaker, I would ask that the body please reject the governor's recommendation on HB 1063.
The delegate from Fairfax, Delegate Keam.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Speaking in opposition to the governor's recommendation.
The delegate has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wasn't planning on speaking to this because I wasn't sure how the ruling was happening, but listening to the conversation and also seeing what's been happening today on other bills, I am not under any assumption that we may be able to find enough votes to override the governor's or reject the governor's amendment. But I wanted to provide a little bit of background on this issue because this is something that's a little bit near and dear to me personally, and something that I've had a small hand in drafting. And I want to first thank the new delegate from Fairfax County for introducing this bill and for all the hard work that she did. And for a freshman member to carry a substantive bill all the way through with 100 votes in the House and 40 votes in the Senate is pretty remarkable. So I wanted to congratulate her on that. And we didn't think that there was any concerns about the bill until, as you just heard, the governor's staff sent down this amendment, which is, just in terms of language, it's pretty short and brief. But in terms of the scope and the purpose, it's very, very different. I want to explain a little bit about the background because I think, regardless of how you vote today, I hope that you will take this message and think this through as we work together in the next couple of years. Some of you might not know this, but about 20-odd years ago, on September 11th of 2001, I was on Capitol Hill in our United States Congress. I was a staffer for a senator at the time, and when 9/11 happened, we were obviously evacuated. I was one of the many, many staffers who had to leave the building and come back in. By the time we were back in operation in the Congress the next day and the next day and the next day, we worked with the then Department of Justice Attorney General to draft a bill called the Patriot Act, which allowed us to go after terrorists and any foreign or domestic threat to our nation. And everything we needed to do from a law enforcement perspective, we wanted to provide that, because the last thing we want to see is another attack on our nation from anywhere else. One of the concerns that we had, though, was as we were overzealously attacking our terrorists and our enemies, we did not want the racial aspect of those who targeted us, those 19 terrorists who hijacked those planes and attacked us, and the fact that they happened to have adhered to a religion. We did not want that to be the war that we were fighting against, because it was not a war against any religion or faith. It was against the ideology that was behind those crazy guys. And so we were approached by a number of organizations and individuals who were concerned that even though they were not of the particular faith as Osama bin Laden or his crew, because of the way they dressed, because of the turbans that they had to wear, because of the articles of faith that they had to wear, they were being harassed and targeted. And in fact, on September 15th, just a few days after 9/11, the very first cold-blooded murder that happened in the United States of America as retaliation for what happened on September 11th was against a gentleman in Mesa, Arizona, who happened to be an Indian American whose religion was Sikhism. And by definition, Sikhism, those that follow that faith, have to not cut their hair or grow their beards, and they also have to wear turbans. So imagine a couple of days after 9/11, a gentleman wearing a turban with dark skin working at a convenience store ended up being the first attack, the first hate crime that happened. And that raised awareness of how we have a multiple group of faiths in our country that many of us might not understand and know about, might not be familiar with, and yet we need to protect them because just the way they dress or the way they express themselves outwardly, their faith, might put them in harm's way. And that's something that I happened to work on. We passed a resolution in the Congress in 2001 as part of the Patriot Act that actually says America condemns any kind of attacks against people based on their faith and their outward expression of faith and the articles that they wore. So we wrote a resolution that condemned racism and hate crimes against those folks. That was 20 years ago. And I would have liked to think that we've moved way beyond that time in a post-racial world that we're living in a diverse nation that we are. And yet, we still see attacks against not only people of Sikh religion, but all other religions. Just a few months ago, there was a brutal murder of some folks who practice that faith in Indianapolis. A few months before that, one of the temples in, I believe, Wisconsin was attacked as well. And many, many other hundreds and thousands of incidents that happened. And just here in the Commonwealth of Virginia, as we've seen a diversity growing in this state, we see so many of us who come from different backgrounds, different religions, different faiths, different traditions, coming to this country, becoming new Virginians. We wanted to send a message that Virginia is, in fact, open to everybody, that we do accept and tolerate everybody's backgrounds, including their faith. And what I noticed, having worked on these issues for a long time, and when Delegate Shin and I were talking about this, what we realized is that our own state's religious discrimination laws were a little bit more generic than it ought to be. That it didn't include those articles of faith, like at some of the federal laws that we've seen in other places. And so what we wanted to do, in a very good faith, very innocuous effort, was to just say, let's add a little bit more language in our code so that those Americans of different faiths who happen to live in Virginia, who might have to wear different outfits because of their faith, will feel as comfortable as somebody like me who's a Christian. And many of you might know my father was a Christian missionary. That's how we came to the United States. So as a Christian faith, of a Presbyterian background, I want to ensure that nobody else in America is treated differently because of their faith. And that was a reason why we drafted this bill. And that's the reason why this was part of the Asian American Pacific Islander Caucus's legislative agenda. That's all it was. We talked to the governor's office and we talked to everybody. We talked to the Family Foundation. Everybody thought that was a great idea at first. Unfortunately, somewhere along the way, somebody decided the language that we drafted and passed 100 to nothing is not good enough. And so now we're facing with a dilemma where, as much as we all support religious non-discrimination, we now have language that uses words like beliefs, which had never been discussed, never been debated. Nobody's ever talked about this in the committee. And here we are at the last minute of the last days of the session talking about something that will expand definition of religion forever in the Code of Virginia. I just don't think this is the right way to do this. So on behalf of some of our colleagues who worked on this issue in good faith, we would hope that we reject this amendment, pass it as it was originally passed, ask the governor to work with us so that next year we can come back with a bill that actually incorporates some of the concerns that he has. And we might be able to find some common ground there. But to do it this way is just not the way to do it. So I really hope and urge that my colleagues will be able to reject the governor's amendment.
The delegate from Culpeper, Delegate Freitas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Speaking of the governor's recommendations.
The delegate has the floor.
Thank you. I certainly supported this bill as it came out from the patron, and I certainly would associate myself with many of the remarks that Delegate Keam has made as well with respect to what is our overall goal, what is our overall objective here. And one of the only concerns that I had with this bill when it was going through, and I still thought it was good legislation, was the idea that, and I've learned this lesson somewhat the hard way before, is when you start getting a little bit too specific with respect to what religious practice you're actually supporting or protecting, the natural question when it goes into a court of law, when it gets challenged, is, well, if you're supporting this, does that mean you're not supporting everything else, or does that not actually have equal protection before the law? Because the legislature specified this but didn't specify that. And so I think in the broadening of the language here, and I mean, when we look at this, what we're really talking about is taking language right out of Title VII from the Civil Rights Act. And so I don't think that the governor was just sitting around coming up with random language out of the sky. I think he was taking existing legal precedent, stuff that is held up in court for decades now, and trying to incorporate that in there so that we can protect religious practice, to include religious practices that are practiced by people where it's a minority faith and maybe people aren't as familiar with it. And ensuring that those people do feel comfortable with the Commonwealth of Virginia, because we have language which mirrors Title VII of the Civil Rights Act and ensures that that religious expression is going to be protected here in the Commonwealth, as long as it's done in a peaceful manner. And so I would encourage everyone to please support the governor's recommendation. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The delegate from Fairfax, Delegate Simon.
Mr. Speaker, speaking of the governor's amendments.
The delegate has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, members of the House, so a couple things I want to address here. I think we're setting some, potentially, depending on how this vote goes, about to set a number of dangerous precedents. And so I think we need to think carefully about what we're doing here. First, I understand the Speaker's ruling. I'm not going to appeal it, but I think that we're opening the door here to hijacking of bills and taking what's a narrow, specific bill and giving it a much broader context here, right? And there's a phrase, we have a lot of these phrases, we have the bingo cards here. One of them is get your own bill. Now, I don't say that with the accent that it usually goes with. Usually that's the accent that the majority leader uses. I'm not even going to try. I'm not even going to try.
Do it.
But it goes to getting your own bill. So, but the reason we say that, Mr. Speaker, and the reason that's an important truism around here is that that's the way we operate. Right? We don't want to put in a bill on a topic and worry that somebody's going to grab it and turn it into something that it was never intended to be. And we shouldn't do it to each other. And we certainly, as an independent branch of government, shouldn't allow the governor to do it, right? But we've opened the door for that. That door's open now, right? So watch out, as the delegate from Enrico said, 5 years from now, 6 years from now, 10 years from now. You guys have opened that door procedurally. But we have an opportunity, procedurally or not, to make a decision about whether we want to do business that way. Right? And I'm going to suggest to you that that's not how we want to do business. And let's talk about Title VII for a second, and why Title VII mirroring Title VII doesn't really work here. Because Title VII, although this language is lifted out of there, Title VII has other language that's not in our Human Rights Act in Virginia. So we want to make this look like Title VII. We can make it look like all of Title VII. But Title VII, under Title VII of the Federal Act, employers must provide a reasonable religious accommodation for employees. But the employer is only required to provide religious accommodations if it would not pose an undue hardship to others. So, for instance, the limiting language ensures religious accommodations are not used to harm other workers, patrons, or the operators of a business. So it would be undue hardship on an employer to allow one employee to make anti-gay comments to a gay employee because it could create a hostile work environment, right? So we don't have any of those guardrails. That's one of these words we probably should retire, but here it is, right? So Title VII talks about how those religious beliefs can be accommodated. It has a broad definition, but we limit that with reasonable accommodation. We don't have any similar language in the Human Rights Act. So what this bill is about, just so we know, because there's a broader context that's happening here, and we know the governor is paying attention to the national debate on a lot of these issues. He seems very, very interested in the national debate on a lot of things. And so we have Supreme Court cases about proselytization, right? The coaches who want to kneel and say, hey, be a good teammate, kneel and pray with me to my God, to Christ. And we have things like that are happening. We have people that want to discriminate, want to proselytize. We have teachers that don't want to use pronouns on the basis of their whole extent of their religious beliefs. That's what this amendment is about. That's what this amendment is trying to legalize. It's not at all what the patron wants to do. And she told you it's not what she wants to do. And this is a hijacking of a bill by the governor to get national attention. We should say no to this bill. You should vote no, whether you think that the governor is right or not. You should vote no because you wouldn't want this to happen to your bill. You wouldn't want it to happen to one of your colleagues. It's the wrong thing to do for the wrong reasons. I really hope that on this one occasion you guys could bring yourselves to vote no on the governor's amendments. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The delegate from Roanoke City, Delegate Rasoul.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Speaking to the governor's recommendation.
The delegate has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen of the House. So, the vote will go down the way it goes down, but I take great pride. Every session I will do a Facebook Live from the chamber, and I'll wander on back behind Tony Wilt over there, and I'll mention the only document that is on the wall of the House of Delegates, the Statute for Religious Freedom. This chamber, unlike any other chamber really in America, is uniquely positioned to be able to defend religious freedom because this is the birthplace of religious freedom in America, this chamber. While Thomas Jefferson penned that document back there, it was inspired as he was working with a young James Madison who was upset because the Anglicans, who were the dominant religion at that time, were abusing the Baptists. And he penned a document just before that talking about how we should never have religious assessments associated with anything that we do. So this is a bill, it'll come and go. This is a vote, it'll come and go. But I hope as we think about this topic and these bills in the future, that we can take a sense of pride in what this chamber represents as we move forward. We never want, and I desperately never want, this to be the center of some national debate because it is just too precious to what this chamber stands for, and it is evident by there only being that one document on the wall. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The delegate from Virginia Beach, Delegate Convers-Fowler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Speaking to the governor's recommendation.
The delegate has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not sure if it's the teacher in me that needed to get this out there, but the changing of the definition of religion, the original definition in the original bill was a protective measure on that person. It applied to that person's outward expression, and it protected them. This new definition means all aspects, and I'm reading it, all aspects of religion, observed, practiced, or beliefs. I'm sorry, there's my screen. Observance, practice, or belief. So if you believe somebody is doing something wrong, you could act upon it. So I'd just like to point out that the definition changed from more of protective definition of religion to the person to a open-ended definition that could allow for the quite opposite. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I urge everyone to vote no on this recommendation.
The delegate from Caroline, Delegate Orrock.
Mr. Speaker, I move the pending question.
Pending question is called for. As many as favor that motion will say aye. Those opposed, no. The motion is agreed to. Shall the bill be amended in accordance with the recommendations of the governor?
What page are we on?
The clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 52, noes 48.
Ayes 52, noes 48. The governor's recommendation is agreed to.